I've never shared this with anyone, but I can't get that night out of my mind. You might understand why when I tell you, or you might think I'm crazy, but I need to get this out because it's been on my mind. My husband always trusted his friend, maybe a bit too much. That trust almost cost me everything. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. One night, something felt different. The atmosphere was electric, and it felt like something big was about to happen. It could have a huge impact, either positive or negative. It was never meant to go that far, but when you're in the moment, it's easy to forget what you're supposed to do. That night, I almost forgot. It all began on an ordinary evening. My husband Mark had invited his friend Dave over for dinner. I've known Dave for years. He's been around ever since Mark and I first got together. He's one of those people who can walk into a room and instantly put you at ease. But I always had this feeling about him, deep down. There was something about the way he looked at me that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if he saw me. In a way, no one else did, but I brushed it off after all. He was just Mark's friend. What could go wrong? That night, we were all having drinks, just the three of us. Mark was in his usual state, relaxed, happy, and laughing. He had no idea what was going on around him. He didn't notice, but I did. It began with a glance or a lingering touch. Dave always had a way of being just a little bit over the top. We were always laughing, just a little too hard at my jokes. For some reason, I felt like I was the one he was focusing on. Maybe I wasn't invisible to him after all. I tried to put it out of my mind, but it was difficult. There'd been a lot of tension between us over the last few months. Mark was unaware of the situation, serving drinks and telling stories. He wasn't aware that things were about to change. Dave was sitting right next to me, his arm brushing mine as he reached for his glass. I just couldn't ignore it anymore. His touch felt different somehow. It wasn't just a friendly gesture. I glanced at him, trying to read his expression. He looked right at me. In that moment, everything felt different. He didn't smile. It wasn't your typical friendly look. It was different. It was as if he were daring me to make the next move. I gave it some thought. I'd never considered crossing that line before, but now it was all I could think about. Mark went to the kitchen to get more snacks, and just as he left the room, Dave leaned in closer. His breath was warm against my skin, and I could feel the heat in my cheeks. He whispered something in my ear. His voice was low and smooth. "You know you're more than just Mark's. To me, you've always been my wife." I was taken aback. Did I understand that correctly? I wanted to step back and stop it, but I couldn't. His words were already on my mind, repeating like a broken record. I was a bit off my game. I should have put a stop to it. I should have told him to back off, but my body was having other ideas. I was battling this urge to do something I knew I would regret. I felt regret before I could even respond. Mark walked back into the room, and Dave pulled away instantly, as if nothing had happened. He cleared his throat and sat up straight, as if nothing had happened. But I could sense it in the air. The distance between us had shifted, and there was no going back. That night, after Mark had gone to bed, I couldn't get to sleep. I kept tossing and turning, my mind racing. I could hear Dave's voice in my head, feeling the heat from his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only one in the room. I just couldn't ignore it anymore. I had a feeling something was going to happen, but I wasn't sure if I'd have the strength to stop it when it came down to it. I had trouble sleeping that night. I tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about what Dave had said. "You're more than just Mark's wife to me." It was like a melody I couldn't get out of my head. I really wanted to, but I tossed and turned, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I asked myself some tough questions, like what I really wanted and what I was capable of. Mark was in the dark about it. He was right there next to me, his steady breathing a reminder of the life we built together. It should have been comforting, but it felt suffocating. How could I even consider betraying him? On the other hand, I hadn't been looking for this. I never asked for Dave's attention, but it was there, just waiting for the right moment to make an appearance. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was in a tricky situation. If I ignored it or tried to brush it off like it wasn't a big deal, I'd be lying to myself. It wasn't nothing. The way Dave looked at me wasn't accidental. That's what scared me the most. I wasn't sure if I could just move on from it. The next morning, everything was back to normal. Mark made breakfast, and Dave joined us for coffee. He seemed fine, but I could tell he wasn't. I could sense the tension between us. It wasn't just in my head. I could see it in his eyes. Whenever Mark wasn't around, he'd give me a quick look. He gave a subtle knowing smile, and I could feel the tension between us. I tried to maintain some distance to avoid getting too close, but it wasn't easy. The more I tried to ignore him, the more it felt like he was pushing back, testing the limits of what I would allow. I started to notice the little things, his casual touches, the way his voice lowered when he spoke to me, the way he leaned in just a bit too much when we had a conversation. Every interaction felt charged, as though we were both waiting for something to happen. One afternoon, when Mark was out running errands, Dave stopped by. I was cleaning up the living room when he knocked on the door. He didn't even have to ask, he just walked in like he owned the place. It was a gesture I recognized, and it made me feel both comfortable and a little uneasy at the same time. "Hey Dave," he said, as he sat down on the couch. "I thought we could grab lunch sometime, just you and me." I was taken aback. There was a change in the atmosphere. The suggestion hung there unspoken but loud enough to echo in my mind. Was he trying to get closer, or was this just his way of being friendly? I wasn't sure what to say. Of course, I could have just said I was busy and moved on. But for some reason, I didn't. Instead, I found myself nodding in agreement. I was pretty out of it. I was just going along with it, agreeing with him. It wasn't my usual style to encourage anything like this. I was loyal to Mark, but Dave's attitude made me think twice. That small, almost innocent invitation felt like a gateway opening. I wasn't sure if I should go through with it, but I was drawn to it. As the day went on, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Every time he looked at me or touched me, it seemed like he was inviting me to do more. I tried to focus on something else and ignore the growing desire that was pulling me in, but the more I tried, the stronger it became. I knew I was on the brink, and part of me wanted to step back. I wanted to remind myself that I had everything to lose, but another part of me, the part that was craving something more, told me that I was already too far gone. What's the harm in taking one more step? The next day, Dave sent me a message. He wasn't just looking to grab lunch anymore. He was looking for something more. He wanted to take me out on my own. I wasn't sure how to respond. I wanted to say. I didn't want to, but my fingers hovered over the screen as if they had a mind of their own. My heart was racing, and my head was spinning. Was this it? Was this the moment that everything would change? I couldn't take my eyes off the message on my phone. Time seemed to stand still for a moment, and all I could do was look at the message Dave had sent. "Just you and me. We both know there's something going on here." I wasn't sure how I felt. Part of me wanted to delete the message and never speak to him again, but then there was this other part, the part of me that I couldn't control, that wanted to say yes. It was the thrill of the unknown and the excitement of doing something forbidden. I put my phone down, stood up, and walked around the room a few times. My mind was all over the place. Mark was due back soon. He'd never find out what was going on. He wouldn't be able to grasp the emotions I was experiencing. How could I even begin to explain this to him? How could I possibly explain how Dave made me feel alive in a way that Mark couldn't anymore? I knew I shouldn't think that way, but I couldn't help but look back at my phone. The message was still there, sitting innocently as though it was no big deal. It was as if Dave hadn't just dropped a bombshell into my life, and now I had to figure out how to deal with the fallout. But I couldn't just ignore it. It was like a magnet, drawing me in. I considered replying to the text. I thought about telling him that. I knew it was the wrong thing to do, but I just couldn't bring myself to send the message. I didn't send anything, and instead spent the rest of the day in a bit of a daze, still processing what had just happened. Later that night, Mark and I had dinner together like we always did. He didn't notice anything different about me. He was in his usual good mood. I was in a good mood, joking about his day at work and asking how mine was. But I couldn't stop thinking about Dave's message. Every time I looked at Mark, I felt like I was hiding something, and I was really starting to feel guilty. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I couldn't stop thinking about what could happen. That's where I was going wrong. The next day, Dave gave me a call. His voice was calm and collected. He asked if I was free for lunch with just the two of us. I wasn't sure how to react. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, and I was worried that the next step I took would be the one that broke everything. I ended the call before he had a chance to say more. My heart was racing. Was I really about to do this? Was I ready to risk everything for a moment of something I wasn't sure I even wanted? I couldn't stop thinking about that phone call. Dave's voice was still ringing in my ears, tempting me to make a choice. I wasn't sure what to do. My inner voice was at odds with itself. One part of me was saying, stop, don't let things go any further, while another part was saying, you might regret not going for it. Maybe this was my chance to feel alive again and experience something I hadn't in so long. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was still carrying the weight of it all on my chest. I could hear Mark getting ready for work in the other room. He was humming a tune, looking completely carefree. I envied him in that moment. He was so confident. I felt like I had a place in his life, but I wasn't sure where I stood anymore. I was feeling pretty uncertain about everything. I picked up my phone and reread Dave's message. We both knew there was something there. My heart was racing. I couldn't believe I was even entertaining the idea. Was I really thinking of going behind my husband's back? I felt guilty, but there was also a strange curiosity. What would it be like? Would it have a lasting impact? I wasn't sure if I'd actually be able to go through with it. I couldn't make up my mind. I was on my own, so I did something I never thought I would. I sent Dave a text. Let's meet up today, but no funny business, just lunch. I sent the message before I had a chance to stop myself. As soon as I did, I felt a bit uneasy. What had I just done? I didn't even have a chance to think it through further. Mark called me from the other room to ask if I'd seen his keys. I quickly came back to reality, feeling guilty for the mere fact that I was sneaking around. I gave him his keys and acted like everything was okay, but inside, I was anything but fine. I was a bit of a mess. By noon, I found myself outside a small cafe, the one where Dave and I used to go when we were younger, before everything got complicated. The place was filled with the smell of coffee and fresh bread. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed, but it had. I wasn't here for a quick lunch, but for something else. Dave approached me with a casual smile on his face. His jeans were snug, and his shirt fit perfectly. He looked good. I was really attracted to him, but I didn't want to back out. He said, "Hey," in his usual smooth voice, but there was something different about it now. There was a certain gravity to his voice, and he had a knowing look in his eyes. He wasn't just here for lunch, he was here because he wanted something more. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound casual, even though I could feel my heart racing. We sat down at a table outside. The sun was shining, but it didn't feel particularly warm. As a matter of fact, the air felt colder than I remembered. Maybe it was because I knew. What was the issue here? Maybe it was because I was finally realizing that I had crossed a line by just agreeing to meet him here. "How's Mark doing?" Dave asked casually, taking a sip of his drink. "He's doing well," I replied, trying to keep things normal. Dave nodded, keeping his eyes on mine. There was no more pretense. The tension between us was really noticeable now, more than ever. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Every word he said seemed to draw me in a little bit more. He had a magnetic presence. "You know," Dave began. "Mark's a great guy, but I sometimes wonder if he really sees you for who you are. Take a look at yourself. You look amazing. You deserve so much more than what you have at the moment." His words struck a chord with me, and I hated myself for how good it felt to hear him say that. I started to reply, but I didn't know what to say. Was he right? Was I just settling? Was Mark really the right guy for me? I was mulling over all these questions, but I didn't ask. I don't have time to answer them right now because right now the only thing that matters is the tension between us. Dave reached across the table and touched my hand. It was a subtle thing, but I felt it. At that moment, I realized I was getting close to crossing a line. I'd never thought I'd get this close to touching my hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, I lingered just a second longer than I should have. The waiter came by to take our order, cutting into our conversation. Dave and I both looked at each other. I knew we were both thinking the same thing. What if we just kept going after the waiter walked away? Everything seemed to come to a standstill. There was a certain electricity between Dave and me. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling us closer together for the first time in what felt like forever. I wasn't thinking about Mark or about what was right or wrong. I was just here with Dave, and I was really looking forward to that moment. Dave didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to say anything. His eyes said it all. His eyes were dark and intense, as if he was waiting for me to make the next move. I could feel his gaze on me, intense and unwavering. For a moment, I forgot who I was. "Are you sure about this?" Dave finally spoke up. His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. He wasn't just asking if I was sure about lunch. He was asking if I was sure about everything that had led up to this point in time. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to say, no, or get up and run away from him. From everything but another part of me, the part that was just so tired was ready to let go and give in. "You have no idea how much I've wanted this," Dave said quietly. His hand was still close to mine. His words weren't an accusation, just a confession. He didn't try to hide what was going on. He was interested in me, and it wasn't just about that moment. It was about everything he'd been holding back for years. I should have said something, anything, to put a stop to this. I should have reminded myself that I have a family and a husband. Who could I trust at the time? I couldn't. I couldn't get a word out. All I could think about was how Dave's eyes made me feel alive, desired, and wanted. "I'm not sure if I can do this." I said it in a quiet, almost inaudible voice. The words felt like they were choking me, but they were the truth. I wasn't sure if I could go through with it, but I also wasn't sure if I could stop myself. "You don't have to do anything," Dave replied. His voice was calm and soothing. "I just want you to be honest with yourself. Do you get that?" I also wanted to say no. I wanted to be honest and say that I didn't feel anything for him. I was interested in him, but I couldn't fake it. I felt it all the time. There was a real sense of tension and desire. It was all there, plain as day. I thought about Mark for a moment. I thought about how I'd never want to hurt him. I loved him so much. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I hadn't felt like this in years. Maybe I was just kidding myself. Maybe I was just tired of putting on a front and acting like everything was perfect. I glanced down at my feet. As I held the knife, unable to look at Dave for a second, I realized this wasn't just about him. It was about me too. I was the one who let things get this far. I was the one who responded to his touch. I was the one who felt this attraction to him. There was no going back now. Before I could reply, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "There you are." It was Mark. My heart stopped. I turned around, and there he was, standing in the doorway of the cafe. He was really happy to see me. I felt like I had been caught off guard. Mark's sudden appearance was like a splash of cold water to my face. My heart was racing, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. Dave quickly took his hand away and sat back in his chair as if nothing had happened. Mark waved to us, and I tried to smile, but it felt like everything in my world had just come crashing down. "Hey," Mark said, walking over to the table. He looked from me to Dave, his eyes on Dave for a moment longer than usual. "How's it going?" Dave gave him a quick grin. I hadn't just been on the verge of crossing a line with him. He was just catching up with his wife. I wanted to say something, explain, but I couldn't. What could I possibly say? How could I possibly explain the tension that had almost led to something? There was nothing I could do to undo it. Mark sat down at the table with a casual grin, unaware of the disagreement that had just taken place between me and Dave. His sudden appearance was like a slap in the face, reminding me that I couldn't avoid the reality of the situation. I didn't know how to act or look at Dave without letting him know how I was really feeling, but I had no choice. I had to act like everything was fine and play it off. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile and trying to act normal. My voice sounded strange as it came out of my mouth. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Mark looked at me. His eyes were warm and familiar. He said, "You know me. I'm always on the go. I thought I'd catch you for lunch." He glanced at Dave, who seemed a bit too casual, as if he hadn't just been holding my hand. "It seemed like you were having a good conversation with each other before. Everything okay?" I nodded, not quite sure what to say. Yes, just getting up to speed. You know, old colleagues. I tried to play it cool, but the words tasted bitter. Dave picked up on the change in mood and gave a nod. Yes, just thinking back to the old days. Good to see you again. He stood up quickly, as if eager to move on from the situation. Mark gave him a nod and smiled. I'll catch up with you later, he said. As Dave walked away, I was thinking a lot of things. How did I end up here? How had I allowed things to get so far out of control? I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at everything I had to lose. I worked for Mark, but I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Once Dave was out of sight, I turned to Mark. I felt a tightening in my chest, a sense of guilt. Mark, I began, but I couldn't find the words. How could I possibly explain that I almost betrayed him? I was on the verge of doing something I couldn't take back. Mark was busy picking up the menu as if everything was fine. So, what are you in the mood to order? I'm ready for a bite to eat. It was as if he hadn't noticed the tension at all. Maybe he had, but he chose to ignore it, and that was more hurtful than anything. I took a deep breath. You're not hungry? He said, looking at me with concern. Hey, are you okay? You've been acting a bit strange since I walked in. Is everything okay? That's when I realized I'd been kidding myself. Mark knew me better than anyone. He could see through my excuses, even the ones I wasn't making. But I couldn't. I needed to be honest with him. I couldn't bring myself to admit what I had almost done. Not now. Not like this. I gave a weak smile and tried to push everything back down where it belonged. I'm fine, just tired. Maybe we can head home after this. Mark seemed to accept it. We can head home after lunch, but if there's something on your mind, you know you can talk to me. Right, I nodded, but inside I was screaming. I had no idea how much longer I could keep this up. What happened next? The rest of the afternoon just flew by. Mark and I went home, and I kept up the act, pretending everything was okay, but my mind was racing. What was I going to do? The connection I had with Dave hadn't just. It wasn't gone. It was still there, just waiting for the right moment to come out. That night, as we were lying in bed, Mark pulled me close as he always did, but I didn't feel the warmth I usually did. It felt like I was lying next to someone I didn't know. How could I possibly look at him the same way after what almost happened? I couldn't pretend that I hadn't come close to crossing a line. I turned away from him, hoping the darkness would hide the guilt in my eyes. The silence between us felt awkward. It wasn't just the physical distance. There was also an emotional distance. I knew I couldn't keep this up indefinitely. At some point, I'd have to address what I'd done. I knew I'd have to face the truth, whether I was ready or not. Mark must have picked up on the change in atmosphere because he asked quietly, "What's going on with you? You're not acting like yourself." I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the tears. Nothing, I said, not wanting to get into it. I'm just tired. But it wasn't just fatigue. I was in a bad way and I didn't know how to fix it. The days passed and I tried to act like everything was fine, but it wasn't. I started to avoid Dave, not answering his messages and not returning his calls. But the more I tried to put some distance between us, the more I realized that I was stuck. I couldn't shake off his hold on me. Then one evening, I got a message. I know what happened, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't going to let it go. It was from Dave. The rest of the afternoon just flew by. Mark and I went home, and I kept up the act, pretending everything was okay, but my mind was racing. What was I going to do? The connection I had with Dave hadn't just vanished. It was still there, just below the surface. I was waiting for the right time to tell him. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, Mark pulled me close as he always did. But I didn't feel the warmth I usually did. It felt like I was lying next to someone I didn't really know. How could I possibly look at him the same way after what almost happened? How could I possibly pretend that I didn't almost cross a line? I turned away from him, hoping the darkness would hide the guilt in my eyes. The silence between us felt awkward. It wasn't just the physical distance. There was also an emotional gap. I knew I couldn't keep this up indefinitely. At some point, I'd have to address what I'd done. I'll have to face the truth, whether I'm ready or not. Mark must have picked up on something being amiss because he asked in a low voice, "What's going on with you? You're not acting like yourself." I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the tears. Nothing, I said, not wanting to get into it. I'm just tired. But I wasn't just tired. I was in a bad way, and I didn't know how to fix it. As the days went by, I tried to act like everything was fine, but I started avoiding Dave. I wasn't responding to his messages or returning his calls. But the more I tried to put some distance between us, the more I realized I was stuck. I couldn't shake off his influence. Then one evening, I got a message. I know what happened, and I'm not going to let it go. It was from Dave.